Alright, now let's go into something that I find particularly terrifying, which is plane-related thrillers, which, of course, these two in particular have something in common, not just because they're both thrillers set on planes, but the fact that they have that distinction that a lot of similar movies have, where they came out freakishly close together. Where I think they're both 2005, but not only that, I think they were like barely a month apart. Where Red Eye came out like at the end of August, and then Flightplan came out like right at the end of September, where it was almost exactly a month, which is not a lot of time for two similar feeling movies as far as like how they were probably advertised to come out. But what's interesting is you would think usually the second movie would take the brunt of that because the first movie would have already captured a certain audience. But apparently Flight Plan's marketing game was quite on point, with Red Eye getting like I think around 96 million to Flight Plan's 223 million. So I guess you could say that's the power not only of Jodie Foster but also the concept. I remember kind of getting a lot of attention when like the marketing was out and stuff like that. Well, Red Eye did also have interesting marketing as well, where I specifically remember the teaser trailer. I actually specifically remember my brother laughing out loud because of how much of a sudden direction the teaser trailer went, where it does pretty much exactly what the movie itself does, where it builds itself up like it's basically a romantic comedy, and then just immediately goes into thriller mode. And it's like just as it appears that Cillian Murphy is sinister, the trailer just ended very abruptly. And I remember that really vividly also. But apparently Flight Plan was the one that was huge commercially between the two. But I guess we can talk about whether or not that means it's the superior one or not, which we tend to know how that can go. And how telling or not telling box office may be. I guess we will start with Red Eye, since it came out first by a month, which is a Wes Craven movie, which was interesting at the time because I remember it getting a lot of attention for not completely feeling like a typical Wes Craven movie, but his sort of mastery of suspense is definitely present through almost the whole thing. Because of course we do have our very deceptive opening, but this eventually leading to a plot that might seem complicated while simultaneously almost comically simple, which is kind of a weird balance to find. But we know just enough about it that it doesn't feel like there's any excess. We know all the details we need to know just for the plot to do what it needs to do and for the characters to do what they need to do, which is the perfect way to do it. This movie is a very swift hour and 25 minutes, and that's pretty much all it has to be. It doesn't feel like anything was cut out, and it doesn't feel like there's anything here that doesn't need to be, that's unnecessary. And obviously, one of the first things to look at in regards to how completely trimmed of fat your movie is like how exposition is handled and character setup and stuff like that. Because the first 25 minutes of that hour and 25 minutes is basically just character build up, which is great because it doesn't feel like we're getting bombarded with it, because like when we get the shots of like Brian Cox at home, we see a lot of Rachel McAdams just through like details around the house, whether it be like her cheerleading uniform in the closet or pictures or something like that. And even the dialogue between them doesn't feel like they're just bombarding us with information, which is great and the way to do it. And then there's also us seeing how good at her job she is, which is the catalyst for the whole movie. In this scene where Jayma Mays calls her up and has to have her work from the airport to get her out of a situation with these unbearable customers. One of which is Robert Pine, which is an interesting small part. But yeah, all of this set up, and then even stuff when we see like the scar on her shoulder when she goes into the bathroom. It all feels like there's stuff that's set up for something, and while that eventually gets to the point where too much setup can almost feel like there's some sort of predictability, like to the point where you're wise to it and you're like, well, I guess we'll find out what that leads to. But this movie is skillful enough that it'll set up things, and then enough will happen and enough will intrigue you that you might forget about certain things that eventually have their payoffs, and then it hits in a really big way when it comes back to you, which is great. Because I don't think they really don't set up the Scar thing right up until it's necessary, and it doesn't feel like it's for the reason you might think it is, or we get there more quickly than you might think as far as what it means for her as a character and as far as development goes. But before we get into all that, and before we get into the payoffs, or even many setups for that matter, we have what appears to be a romantic comedy at the start of this movie that goes on for some time. Like I said, I would love to get reactions to people who went into this movie that did not know that didn't know it was a thriller. I mean, obviously the opening credits set up something, but they're vague enough to where so much time is devoted to the two of them sort of, having a rapport with each other. It's, like I said, it makes you forget setups that you only remember when the payoffs happen, and that makes them all the more satisfying and effective. Because you kind of don't, you see them coming from a mile away, but then by the time they actually happen, they're able to sneak up on you again, which is great. But yeah, so we have, I guess there's a lot of setups in here also, where we have the idea of him knowing what her drink of choice is, but the way he dances around it, pretends like he doesn't know what it is, and the way he masterfully builds it up to that. And how like even the small things like that, like in this conversation, it all feels like, even when you know the concept, even if you've already seen the movie, you can still kind of get caught up in it a little bit because the chemistry is actually there. And because obviously McAdams and Murphy are so good in general anyway, they completely nailed this. But also the fact that while you can get caught up in that and their chemistry, it's also the fact of when you know all the details of the movie from beginning to end, how all these charming things have some kind of sinister underlying thing about them. Like the fact that it's charming when he's guessing what her drink is, and like almost ingredient by ingredient figuring it out. But the fact that he already knows, and it's like just to show how slyly manipulative he is, to go through that whole process of not just outright saying, I think your drink is the sea breeze, doing that whole premeditated guessing game shows just how meticulous he is, and how he even mentions later that this kind of thing is basically what he's hired to do. Like as far as like killing people is not even really his thing. Like he has people that will do that, and he himself is not very good at it. So it's this manipulation and this, meticulous planning that's his whole scenario and what he's the expert at, which makes him pretty much just as terrifying as if he was somebody that was eventually as deadly as we learn him to be by the climax. But in the meantime, just these lead-ins are just sinister enough that it really sets us in place, and we feel kind of as imprisoned as an audience as McAdams does. And I love the way the angles and the seating are to where the whole movie has a claustrophobic feel by having him on the aisle seat. And it's like apart from like some of the beginning scenes when he's like helping the one with her luggage and stuff like that, I'm pretty sure almost all of the shots of him where they're both in their seats, are from this angle where McAdams is in the foreground and then he's there. So it's like we're kind of trapped in this area, and we never kind of get out into the aisle until she manages to trick him into getting her to at least go to the bathroom and stuff like that, or when he's getting distracted by other people, when that woman keeps distracting him about her luggage and stuff like that. And the way it sort of traps us like that is something that could be... It's something that's so subtle also, it might go completely unsung as far as the approach to the suspense and how it makes us feel trapped as an audience, along with her, and kind of sets that claustrophobia in. Because obviously the plane setting is going to be claustrophobic as it is, but to feel literally trapped by his body because of the seating arrangement and the camera angles, just add to that even more. And in the way also how we build up, how there's so many clues leading up to this that just completely blow by us. Where it's like some of them are pretty obvious, like when he says, he's talking about his parents, and then he says, before I killed them. which just seems like, I mean, I don't know if you can completely deliver that in a way in a way that doesn't draw attention. But like I said, the rapport here is so romantic comedy at this point, and Murphy has such this way of being able to be both potentially this charming romantic interest and somebody super sinister, that you can buy it as either one. Like it. I feel like they really chose Murphy carefully when they were casting this, because there were a lot of actors that could have just totally blown this and not found that perfect balance in the way that Murphy can. But there's also the stuff where he kind of flips it on her when she shows up at the seat, and he's the one that says, "You're not stalking me, are you?" Like I said, just those clever things where you can tell he's somebody that's really mapped this out and has made himself look as unthreatening as possible up to this point. To the point that that's just the job at this point, and how many times he's probably used this to his advantage in the past, to eventually get to this point. And there's even the moment that scene when they're like taking calls. Like she says she has calls to make, and then he starts taking calls as well. Just kind of seems like this romantic comedy thing. But there's this particularly blatant clue right here that seems totally harmless when they're on the plane and he takes another call, and it's like, oh, sorry, this old thing. And he says, so it's still happening? And then he confirms the time, 5:30, and then he hangs up, and it's like, calls, and she's like, oh yeah, I know how that is. And we just learned right before this that 5:30 is when the political target of this assassination or attempted assassination is going to be arriving at the hotel. So it's like it's right there in the open. It's right there in front of her. What is going on? But it's just so seamless to any other scenario that it just plays like any other thing. And then once you realize what's going on, it's like every fucking thing was a clue, and you didn't even realize it. And certainly she didn't realize it, because that's another one of those things where to believe her as a character, we'd have to believe she never saw this coming. And if we, as the audience, totally buy into his manipulation, certainly she did. Especially with his charm being right there, up close and personal. And then also, as far as like the believability of her in McAdams' performance, another great thing that she really accomplishes here, apart from just seeming like generally likable, but also somebody that's kind of at the end of their rope and also just went through a family tragedy and all. It's just a whole bunch of stuff at once. You can genuinely see her like breaking throughout the movie, where it's like of all the times and of all the things to happen. And it's like the way it just sort of like breaks your spirit entirely, that you like, it's not even like, oh my god, I'm so terrified. It's just like her spirit is broken to be in this scenario. And for her dad to be, obviously, he's practically being held hostage without even realizing he's being held hostage, after she's just trying to grieve another family member, and as like, obviously her mom's not even in the picture, but it's like, I'm assuming because she seems to have much more relationship with Brian Cox, and her mom's only mentioned in dialogue like once or twice when her dad says like, how's she doing. There's clearly like a distance kind of going on here, and that's another one of those things that's not over-explained in a really great way. But the fact that you can just see like a real, while that is in there, also fear is obviously definitely in there, but it's like it feels like real fear. Like it doesn't feel like movie fear necessarily, where it's like she's kind of really playing up, like looking directly into the camera and saying, "Look how terrified and scared I am all the time." It feels very real, that it's like the fear in particular is what's kind of breaking her on top of all the emotions she's already had up to this point. And it feels like a real character in a real scenario, which was probably going to make or break this movie's concept in general. So once again, that's another case like Murphy, where it's like the casting probably was like the walking the tightrope on this, and they just happened to find the two perfect people that executed this as well as it possibly could have gone. And then the use of suspense, of course, because not only are we dealing with this concept, but this being a Wes Craven movie, and it does feel like there's one particular moment that feels very classic Wes Craven style suspense, and that's the moment when he talks about the fact that her dad is being held hostage without him knowing so, and that there's a dude outside with a knife, and she insists on calling him to make sure he hasn't been hurt. And when she calls him, we see the inside of the house, and it looks empty, and it's just the phone ringing in an empty room, which looks really, really fucking sinister in this scenario. And it lingers for a long time before Brian Cox walks into the room and he's perfectly fine and has no idea what's going on right now. And it's scenes like that where the Craven really comes out of it in this really great way. And then, of course, eventually that suspense is going to keep getting ramped up more and more as it goes on, which is interesting because the characters are not leaving this one place. So it's like, how confined in this one place do you ramp up the suspense? And that's the brilliance of not just what Craven's doing, but the writing as well. Just always finding something different, whether it be her trying to leave the note with soap on the mirror in the bathroom, or the scene especially where the old woman comes up to her to talk about the Dr. Phil book, and he's, over there with the luggage, and it's like all this stuff is going on at once, and then like the attendants are coming through with the cart. So it's like all of these things that would be stressful in any normal scenario are all happening at once while this thing is going on that nobody on the plane but these two knows about. And it's the way that builds, and then the use of the turbulence and the fact that they're going through a storm, and like how everything is shaking in certain places. There's one point that's particularly chaotic, where the turbulence is really bad, and all this stuff is getting ramped up, and it's like the clock is running out, and things are getting closer. Like her dad's getting more and more danger, and then just something as mundane as the attendant coming through and offering peanuts, and the way he just grabs them and just throws them down, and like even the smallest little additions to this already really stressful situation just feel like they're ramping it up even more. Like just like the peanuts, something you would never suspect would be ramping up the tension by itself. Like I said, the way it's building all these pieces, and it's so, like I said, it's all in one place, and not a lot necessarily is going on, but it feels so chaotic because of how it's all built up and the scenario that's already taking place. And that's basically what the movie accomplishes for its runtime, until we eventually get to our climax. But even then, when you talk about the plot, where I was talking about how the plot is complicated but also weirdly simple, the idea of, tracking her down and getting on the plane with her and then getting her to change the room so that they can do something as simple as firing a missile at the room, to take this political figure out. But the climax itself also is, like the whole thing feels surprisingly airtight yet reckless at the same time, but like so thought out. But then the climax is going to completely sort of break this whole thing of feeling airtight, and everything is like that chaos is going to break out in a way that we haven't seen yet. And then what's interesting about this is everything from here on, like, it's been, we had the build up, the character build up, where everything felt really calm and like it was practically a romantic comedy, and then everything else, all the suspense that's been building has been all in this one claustrophobic area. And now the last 20 to 25 minutes is just going to be the payoff to this, where it's like just a straight, almost like a straight 20 minutes of just action, where we have their chase through the airport. Well, actually, first off, the payoff for the scar, where it's like when she's talking about, when they've landed and she's talking about the scar and what happened to her, and it's like, oh, here we're getting more backstory. And while backstory is great, especially this late in the movie, you can probably ask yourself, well, it's kind of late for this, and it's like, is this anything that's going to add any more to the character already? And then we get that, and as we're embracing it, it's just like, oh, it's just backstory. We realize it's not necessarily just backstory, it's the setup to the fact that she's about to fuck him up. Like, it's the lead-in to her stabbing him. And then once she stabs him, we basically get like 20 straight minutes of action, from the chase through the airport, and then the assassination attempt itself, and then her racing home in time to save her dad, and then the point when Ripner comes back and there's a whole fight that takes place. Where, once again, we're kind of back in the Craven territory of a woman getting pursued through her house by a psycho with a knife. Feels familiar, but also this is still as expertly done as it's ever been by him. And all of this leading up to some of these callbacks happening, like the fact that he hates being called Jack, so that's what she calls him to antagonize him, and then when he headbutts her earlier in the movie to knock her unconscious, which is which is wildly unexpected. And then the fact that she's able to headbutt him back during this climax in the house, and how the callbacks are still happening. There's just so much chaos going on that it's almost hard to acknowledge them as such and how well they've played out and been built up to this point. And then ultimately leading to this point where they both manage to get a shot in, where she shoots him once and then Brian Cox is the one that ultimately takes him down. I will say the one unsatisfying thing about this, and I guess technically it doesn't matter because one way or the other, Ripner is no longer a threat, but I have always found it weird. We don't really seem to get a particular confirmation on Ripner's status when it ends. Because the last time we see him, he's on the ground and he's still alive after having been shot twice. Like, there's no, like, head tilts to the side and he's dead thing. And we don't see, like, we hear, like, sirens, but we don't see, like, cops coming in. And it's like, so it's interesting to me that we have no idea if Ripner is alive or dead. But like I said, I know it doesn't really matter because we just know he's not a threat now. But that's just always kind of been weird to me. Like, I felt like it was just, like, it ends, like, really in a big hurry. Where we finally get the comeuppance for the unbearable couple, and then it just ends. So that, if there was one thing where I was talking about how it's like the perfect runtime and how there's no extra and it doesn't feel like there's anything that's missing, that's the one thing that's always felt like kind of open to me. But like even just like, the whole he's dead head tilt would have been some kind of, closure or something. But, like I said, he's been dealt with, so I guess that's what's really important. So, yeah, so it may have ended slightly in a hurry, but I could still really appreciate it for that, for like having nothing else to drag it out at all. It just picks up all of its little loose ends and then it's done, and that's all it needs to do. And I remember it being I remember thinking it was going to be good when it was coming out, and then I remember being kind of surprised by just how good the reviews were for it, and how like critics especially like really took to it and praised it. And the fact that it did live up to that as this very it almost feels rare about how quick it is as far as a thriller where you go to the theater, you get everything you want, and then it's over. And I remember leaving the theater really satisfied with it. So going on to Flightplan, which I didn't see in the theater despite it being the much more popular movie at the time, I saw, like, as soon as the DVD came out, I saw it, and I remembered a lot of people kind of talked about it. And like I said, the concept itself, that sort of, like, Twilight Zone-esque setup, of somebody just disappearing on a plane. I want to say, there was an Alfred Hitchcock Presents episode along those lines as well. Yeah, so this whole idea of this seemingly impossible concept, was immediately intriguing in that way, where when you go into a movie not really knowing where it's going but has a concept like this, it could be like the most grounded thriller ever, and your mind will still go into all these different places where you're wondering, like, is it hallucinations? Is it a sci-fi kind of thing? Is it like... So many options come to mind. That just immediate intrigue of wondering how it possibly got to this point and where is it going to... It's one of those movies that you would go into constantly asking yourself, how does this end? Like, what is the ultimate payoff? And, like, where is it headed? Which probably, for people that maybe aren't fans of, like, routine thrillers and would want something that kind of pays off that intrigue in a more unexpected way, might be, like, super disappointed and feel like it's not quite worth all the build-up when you see the direction it eventually goes. But as far as how it works as a thriller in the meantime, it is one of those movies, and we'll talk more about these in the next video. These movies where you either just totally embrace the concept or you don't. Either it's something where you can see where all the holes are, but you just kind of run with it and kind of let it, guide you wherever it's going to go. Or you can just say, this is totally ridiculous, completely implausible, and I don't buy anything. And yeah, as far as it being like, I remember just kind of embracing it and kind of going with it. And like I said, that keeping that feeling of how is this going to end um, up well enough, even if the payoff isn't quite as intriguing as it's set up, but still. Um, some as far as like everybody looking suspicious and the whole idea of constantly questioning your main character in particular. I talked about that a lot with Girl on the Train recently, where it's like those movies where you have to constantly question if the main character is reliable or not can be very intriguing. And obviously, Foster is, even despite the kind of movie that it is, Foster seems to be really bringing her A game acting wise, as far as setting up this person who is like equal parts desperate and manic and terrified and like we were saying, potentially unreliable, depending on where this is going to go. Because obviously it's a character that's been built on tragedy, with her husband having recently died from potentially suicide, potentially an accident, potentially neither, and still gripping with that, and having a daughter that's scared to even go outside after all this has happened, and who is potentially being watched by these weird, sinister people next door through the windows, who may just be, neighbors who were just looking at a particular time, or maybe something else. And it's like the way it's sort of building up this terror and mystery throughout it before they're even on the plane. Like, there is something really ominous about the opening 10 minutes or so. And then the build up to, this is a plane that she knows very well. She partook in its manufacturing, which is clearly going to have something to do with the plot. Mainly the fact that she knows the ins and outs of it and knows, like, if now that her daughter has seemingly vanished into thin air, there's only so many places you can be on a plane, and she knows all of them. And which just adds that whole idea of if she searches every nook and cranny and she's not here, then she may have to start questioning her own sanity, something all the other passengers have started doing immediately, long before her, up to and including Peter Sarsgaard and his twisty character, where we start off, he just looks like another annoyed passenger because there's some unruly kids on the flight. But then it's revealed that he's the air marshal, and then of course eventually he's Peter Sarsgaard. So there's there might be even more to him, for all we know. This is another case where we were talking about how perfectly cast Rachel McAdams and Cillian Murphy were. This is a case where casting might be a spoiler when you cast Peter Sarsgaard as this character. The character is essentially in charge of her and keeping her sort of under control, but also helping her in this scenario of her daughter could not only exist but also somehow be on the plane somewhere, despite the fact that there's no record of her being on the plane. There's no record of anything she left behind, except one thing. Which is the point where the movie does reach a point in the middle where they do send us in a direction that seems believable. Like it's believable as a potential twist, where she is told that her daughter is dead, and died before the events of the movie took place. Like her and like the daughter and husband died together. And the way they present this is a pretty believable twist if you're not watching the runtime and the movie's only halfway over at this point. But even then, even if that was the case, it still could have gone in a totally different direction had that actually been the twist. We do get what I really like especially about that reveal, that in quotes reveal, is we have the Greta Scacchi scene where she's like this psychiatrist of sorts that happens to be on the plane, and she's talking to her about dealing with death and grief and the fact that losing a child and stuff like that, and how we actually have time the audience has time to actually accept that as the twist, and like that scene goes on long enough to where the audience has time to be like, oh, maybe that is okay, maybe, because immediately in a movie like this, your brain is already set to try to figure out where the twists are, and if you get one early, it'll be like, oh, that can't be it, it's too early, and you're already looking. This period with the Greta Scacchi scene is enough time to be like, oh shit, I think this might actually be what the twist is. And then that's right at the moment where we have the one piece of evidence that she existed, which is the heart that she drew on the window. So then it goes from there, and then you can keep guessing all over again. And talking about whether or not this has any sort of believability whatsoever as far as the story goes. How nobody on this flight saw this girl, and all the other stuff, and all the stuff that Sarsgaard and the other flight attendant have been planning, and how all of that has gone under the radar somehow. Um, it is asking a lot, but as far as it having a real feel and like some sort of grounded feel, is gonna come from Foster's performance pretty much exclusively. And the way she, like we were talking about with Adams, the way she plays up that desperation and mania and terror so believably, like it's somebody that is, like it puts you in the mindset of somebody that would be in that scenario where you have a very close loved one that would just somehow vanish into thin air and you can't get anybody on your side. It reminds me a lot of a movie called Breakdown with Kurt. I can't remember if we've talked about this or not on this channel, but the movie Breakdown with Kurt Russell, where Kurt Russell's wife is taken, and he's in this, town that's out in the middle of nowhere, and it almost seems like the whole town is like in on it in a way, and it's like he can't get anybody on his side or convince anybody that there is an emergency situation here, and somebody that he was here with and was just here and loves is just gone and cannot be found anywhere. And the Breakdown especially is a movie that's terrifying because of how real it feels. And Flightplan finds that to an extent through Foster's performance, and that carries it a lot and kind of takes you enough, even if you are, poking holes in it constantly and constantly asking questions of how this could even be. If you're not, just taken in by the concept itself and trying to figure out like where it could possibly go believably and how, what sort of ending we could come to. There is the other thing where we get some suspicious people, like Sean Bean is in this as well, who has played his fair share of villains. And he plays a captain that seems almost overly concerned with his passengers. He's very stoic about it, but he's like, we can't be worrying these people. These people are, on my responsibility. And it's like, it's nice to see that, but it gets extreme to the point where you're almost expecting him to say, I would literally jump into the middle of fucking oncoming traffic for all of these people, every single one of them. And it's like, you could probably tone down that character a little bit to the point that it actually starts to make him look a little suspicious, which is interesting. But especially since I believe it's him that breaks the news to her about the potential idea of her daughter having died. Making him look guilty is an interesting approach to take. And then there's the whole this movie, interesting. This very sort of routine thriller deals in post 9/11 fear, which is interesting. I suppose it's inevitable, being only 2005 at this point, and being set on a plane, and the fact that there are Arabs aboard this plane. And so the whole idea of anybody being a suspect in this scenario, it does seem inevitable that we would reach this conclusion only 4 years after the fact. So there is that, even if it does feel a bit heavy-handed for a movie of this caliber. But still, it does raise this whole idea, but still there is the whole factor of all of this having taken place completely blind. And you can say, like everybody gets wrapped up in themselves and is only focusing on their problems. Still, there are things that do feel like a reach, but for the most part, at the time especially, I remember just sort of taking it for as it is. Nowadays, having seen more thrillers and having seen thrillers that are, a bit more smart in their approach and a bit more airtight in their approach, even like I said, just Red Eye having been the month before, it could be easy to see the flaws in it pretty clearly. So it's really just a matter of how much the concept and how much Foster's performance, how far those can take you. And the whole presence here of the Sarsgaard character as well can be intriguing, even though, like I said, because he's Sarsgaard, you just kind of constantly have this vibe he's probably sinister in some way or another. If anything, the big twist is the flight attendant involved, but that's also the case where she was always the one that was kind of taking control and trying to, be assertive in the situation, almost to the point that it was detrimental to Foster, keeping her own sanity. You can see how much of a part that she plays in it specifically, but there is something, like I said, about that whole fear that's intriguing about it, and can actually, and it does have a certain real feel to it when you see the way she plays the fear and the desperation. especially when she becomes more and more outcast. Like when she's like gets into the inner workings of it, and eventually Sarsgaard brings her back down and receives applause for catching her. And we even get like there's also like an interesting sort of separation here between the classes where it's like the people in coach are the ones that applaud him, but the ones in first class when he walked through are like act really entitled and say like, "Oh, you're gonna hang on to her this time." So it's like that's an interesting kind of outlook into that. That's just kind of here briefly in this one scene as she walks through. But yeah, then pretty much right after this, all the twists are revealed, and it's a lot more uncomplex than you would have suspected. And there's a lot of things where it's like the choices that the Sarsgaard character makes can seem quite reckless, and he seems very dependent on the idea that nobody will believe her still as it goes in this whole thing. And he's very reliant that she's not going to bring up what he has confessed to this point. And it still asks a lot, especially when it goes full on into routine thriller. And it seems like a whole lot is cleared up just by the. I mean, yeah, it clears up a lot that it turns out that her daughter exists and everybody knows that she exists now. But it still feels like there's a lot of questions in regards to the things this character should probably be being asked about what she knew about and what she didn't know about. How the like the whole hijacking thing that Sarsgaard built up that she was a terrorist. A plane still blew up, and the person that was the authority figure was in that explosion. But the fact that her daughter exists is apparently. Oh, I guess it was actually the guy that was the law enforcement, and yeah. I mean, they did eventually catch the flight attendant, and she probably, spilled the beans and all that, but still, I'm not sure how she. I'm assuming she gave herself up because she looked like she was fleeing successfully the last time we saw her, and then just the next time we see her, she's in handcuffs, so. Yeah, that's another thing where it seems like it's a lot of things are kind of left open, but if you just take it, as this enjoyable thriller as it is, it's fine. Like, it's probably a movie that I come back to occasionally, not as frequently as I did in the first couple of years it was out, because it was on movie channels a lot at the time as well, and I remember seeing it a lot then also. Like, I was really into it, like when it first came out, but yeah, its holes are a lot more apparent these days. So there's that, and Dinning itself, not only is it just kind of letting a lot of things slide, it's also can be super super cheesy when it could have been a really strong moment. Like it is, I mean, it still kind of is a strong moment when she walks through the airport and she's holding her daughter, and all of the passengers that doubted her are seeing this, and it's like, oh, we fucked up. And that's a powerful moment. But then there's like one piece of audio that's so fucking stupid. It's a guy saying like she never gave up, and it's making her like this sort of Jesus-like figure, and it's like that. Take out that piece of audio, that's a pretty strong scene. But that's the case where it seems like a small detail, but it kind of completely ruins the moment. And then the movie just kind of stops there. So yeah, so things are wrapped up, I guess. Obviously not near as satisfying of a movie as Red Eye, and obviously it's when you put a bit more thought into how the plot plays out and how the concept works and its rules and just how grounded it can be. Because I'm all for just accepting a thriller as is, just for the entertainment value and just running with the concept even if it has holes in it. But it's pretty inarguable that the more grounded and the more those holes are filled in, the more satisfying your final beats are going to be, and that's something that Red Eye really accomplishes well. I still have fun with Flightplan, even knowing all of its ins and outs and how uncomplicated the plot actually is. But yeah, like I said, you don't necessarily have to have a complicated plot like we saw with Red Eye, where it's like the plan was complicated, but the overall objective is like quite simple to the way that it's admirable that it doesn't need to be. It knows that it doesn't need to be complex, so it just doesn't. It just does what it needs to do, which is all a thriller like this really needs to do. So, yeah. So I think that's how I feel about these. So, as I said, next we're going to go more into two other movies that have pretty outlandish concepts, and it's like whether you buy them or not. And then we'll go from there into probably the new releases and another Tremors and all that. And then whatever's after that. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.